All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Mark Calabria, Senior Advisor to the Cato Institute and former Director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Welcome to Free the Economy, Mark.
Richard, just so great to be here.
So, over the past few years, from say the COVID era, 2020, 2021, to today, we've seen a lot of ferment in the housing market. We've had rapid price appreciation in certain large markets. We've had, of course, an increase in mortgage lending rates driven by Fed hikes. And my understanding is the one measure of affordability, the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, is at or near all-time highs right now. So we've had a lot of change over the past few years. Do you think we're still going to be in an era of rapid change going into 2025? Or are we actually settling into kind of a new stable equilibrium where there's going to be higher prices and higher rates?
I think the latter. I think we're settling into a bit of a new equilibrium, and that while I still think that we'll still have price increases, but I think they'll start to moderate. Or what I say, the first derivative's got to be positive, but the second derivative seems to be turning negative.
Right.
And so I think we are slowing into that. Now, it's important to keep in mind that in many jurisdictions, supply is relatively inelastic. And while I think many people assume that means prices can't go down, in fact, what it means is that prices can actually be more volatile with the same shift in demand. And you are seeing that in some markets. I mean, maybe the poster child for this is someplace like Boise, Idaho, where prices shot up incredibly
Right.
and have like basically collapsed. So I think in some areas of the country, you're going to actually see real price declines in 2025. Not enough to bring us back to long-term measures of affordability, but enough to start to see prices going to go down in some markets. And as our realtor friends always say, it's location, location, location. So any generalities, you have to be cautious about. We are seeing different things we're starting to see softness in the southeast that hadn't been there. And even though a few years ago it was really kind of the West Coast that was softening, that started to stabilize. But overall, I mean, I think we are entering a more stable situation where the kind of increases in unaffordability that you've seen, which I guess you really should put in, it's really almost not quite unprecedented, but close to it. Really, the just run up in unaffordability you've seen starting in about 21, 22. I can't remember, even you go back to the mid 2000s, it's still just record kind of change in a short number of years.
Yeah. So, having served in the federal government before in issues like this, what do you think the incoming administration, of course, that's what everyone's talking about now on every topic. What's the new administration going to do in terms of housing policy? So, Trump's nominated former NFL star and Texas State Representative Scott Turner for Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, which for people who've been around along, of course, I can't help but thinking of Jack Kemp, another former football star who was HUD Secretary back in George H.W.'s day. Uh, what do you think the the priorities for the administration going to be when it comes to like housing, homeownership, mortgage, and what does the HUD pick tell you about that?
Great. And so let's start out with you do have this fundamental tension that so much of the supply issue is state and local. We
Right.
we in Washington don't control zoning, and that's probably a good thing. But it does mean that you have a lot of jurisdictions where supply is essentially inelastic. The process is extremely complicated, and then unfortunately, the Washington response often seems to be to increase demand subsidies. We all recall during the campaign, Vice President Harris promised additional down payment assistance, which of course would have driven up prices. And we certainly seen in the last few years where the Biden and Harris administration has weakened underwriting standards in a way that have increased demand. Again, unfortunately, the Washington response is often to make things worse when you have a bad situation. So, my hope would be that an incoming administration would recognize that demand policies are not solutions to supply side constraints, and that perhaps we would see a return to a little bit more responsible underwriting at Fannie, Freddie, FHA, at HUD, and that you would see that kind of moderate. So again, if you've got inflation as you've had in the housing market, you actually really want to pull back on demand rather than increase it. So that'll be one aspect. Now, in addition, Mr. Turner is from Texas, and I often hear people say, what's the right way to do housing? Well, Texas, where and I'm going to set aside that even places like Austin, unfortunately, have started to, still relatively pro-growth compared to, say, San Francisco, but you're starting to see motions in the other direction where perhaps some of, a little bit of backlash against, the housing price appreciation and growth in places like Austin. But by and large, Texas is still a really good example of how do you do zoning and land use. I think it's also important to keep in mind, and this is going to cut a couple of different ways. Mr. Turner has served in state and local government. And I remember my experience working in the Senate years ago. And of course, many members of Congress are former state and local officials. Former state and local officials tend to show a tremendous amount of deference to local zoning decisions because they were there and they don't like to second guess other state and local officials. So I do believe that the secretary can use the bully pulpit. How do you raise these issues? Maybe a little name and shame. How do you try to get the San Franciscos of the world, to kind of change their procedures? So you have some levers there. Depending on how strong you want to be about it, there are other levers, whether you want to, use fair housing litigation against some of these places. That's an open question. Certainly was discussed by the Biden administration, but never really implemented. Another thing that was proposed, and Vice President Harris proposed this, and there was some use of this in the Biden administration, is essentially trying to bribe local governments. We're going to send
Mhm.
a few $1 million to San Francisco government in the hopes that they'll liberalize their land use market. I think it's, as you can probably guess, Richard, I'm a little bit skeptical of that approach.
Yeah,
Partly there's certainly a philosophical, like, why again are we paying San Francisco to fix a problem that it can fix on its own without being paid, that it created? But all that aside, even if you bought into that kind of approach, the amount of money it would take to change the local political equilibrium are far beyond what any of us would ever want to see spent, and far beyond what would be spent. So I'm fairly skeptical that the carrot approach at the federal level is the right one. I am really excited, and I think this has been a bit under the radar screen, but I think the designee for Interior is somebody who I see is open to using federal land for housing. And we already have a system in place in Nevada, which, if you're not familiar with it, this was created by Harry Reid decades ago, where federal land is converted to housing outside of Las Vegas and Clark County.
hmm
Now, like Harry, since Harry Reid did start it, as you can guess, it's only useful for Nevada. That's Harry Reid for you. But to me, that's a model that you could use in a place like Denver or a place like Seattle or even San Francisco. We all, many of us have walked by the Presidio. That used to be
right.
federal land. There's housing on it now. So all this is to say there's a lot of federal land out west, and I think there's a real interest at Interior and at HUD and at the incoming administration to figure out how much of that we can convert to housing. Obviously it's not a fix everywhere, doesn't really do much for you east of the Mississippi, but it can be a significant impact in a number of states. And if we can take pressure off in those states, so you take pressure off the housing market in California or pressure off in Colorado, Nevada, that relieves pressure migration from Texas or anywhere else people might move through. So I do think it's a helpful approach. Mr. Turner, when he worked at the White House, worked on the opportunity zones. He came after 2017 tax reform was done, but he helped with the implementation of opportunity zones. So I do think, and it's fascinating and great that you mentioned Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp kind of had that very sunny conservatism, that very optimistic,
hmm
did not approach this as like, well, the world's going south. He was a really much opportunity. How do we expand access? And I think you're really going to see Turner in that same kind of Jack Kemp mode of how are we creating opportunity for people? How are we allowing people to lift them up by their bootstraps? Now, I think in some instances that's going to result in some policies that libertarians might ask themselves, well, we're not always in favor of subsidies. Are they going to be effective? How well is it going to be targeted? And obviously, there's a very lively debate going on in the research literature about how effective opportunity zones have been, for example. But I think you're going to see that real approach on his part to try to be, the opportunity HUD secretary.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question because on the one hand, a lot of people would say, well, the best policy is a sort of an even, flat policy across the board, and we'll let the chips fall where they may, versus the sort of much more targeted place where we say, like, well, we're going to designate these 10 areas that are opportunity zones, and we're going to put extra investment in there. We're going to try and channel private investment through various government incentives. Um, and so in the first half, it's harder, to say, even if you say this is the most effective, economically efficient strategy in the long term, it's difficult as a political leader to point to say, look, we fixed this problem right here. And that's what generally voters in the public want, is to be able to, for people in power to be able to say, look, we fixed the problem. And with the sort of like the targeted approach, um, you can at least point to, here's a ribbon cutting, here's a program, here's some stuff that, here's a building that got built, right?
I mean,
Um,
there may be nothing politicians love more than ribbon cutting. That's absolutely true. It is worth observing. So probably until about 10 years ago, the academic consensus in the literature had really moved away from place-based policies to more person-based policies. And part of the concern, of course, is if you're subsidizing location A, are you creating new economic activity, or have you simply shifted economic activity from location B? So actually, are you having a net positive effect? And of course, throughout American history, whether it's the Dust Bowl in the 30s, Okies moving west, there has been this sense of how do we, if you subsidize people to move away from declining areas, not only does that increase their opportunity, it decreases pressure on the labor market in those declining areas. And so to me, it's been interesting that I feel like the conversation has shifted back toward these debates about place-based assistance. Now, I don't necessarily feel like the economic research consensus has shifted, but the political debate has really shifted. And of course, some of this has to deal with the China shock and things that we've seen in the Midwest job loss. And again, I would say, it's perhaps I should look at this optimistically as a researcher. Well, boy, we're getting another round of research points on whether place-based strategies are going to work or not.
Right. And so you've talked a lot and written a lot about the mortgaged back, the federal backed mortgage entities, what are called the GSEs, government sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that have a lot to do with mortgages in this country. Those are these theoretically for profit companies that have this special relationship to the government. And then during the Great Recession, they were sort of brought under more explicitly under government control, where they've sort of stayed for a long time, despite that not being the original plan. And so a lot of people, whether they're focused on housing and mortgage stuff, or whether they're just Wall Street people that are interested in investment opportunities, have been talking about, well, are they going to be reprivatized? Are they going to be sent out back into the wild? I know this is, you could talk a whole hour about that, but
That's just
what's the kind of micro explanation for, are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac going to be, are they going to be relaunched as sort of like mostly independent companies, or are they kind of like permanently, it's like Amtrak, they're like forever under government control?
So I think they're gonna be, relaunched. And I don't know. Not only did I have the benefit of being FHFA director and conservator for Fannie and Freddie, I worked on the statutes that created the underlying work. So it really is something I've been thinking about for 20 plus years. And so it's important to keep in mind first that the conservatorships under which Fannie and Freddie are, a conservatorship is essentially administrative bankruptcy. It's just simply you're substituting a bureaucrat for a judge, basically. I just happen to be at one time that bureaucrat, if you will. And so the purpose of that conservatorship really is to fix the companies, bring them back to financial health, and put them back out. And we have seen that instead take a very long, convoluted route, 16 years now, where the government has not been willing to do that, or has slowed it, or used it for policy purposes. The analogy I would kind of use is, a couple of years ago when Hertz went bankrupt, it's as if the bankruptcy judge decided and said, hey, electric vehicles are the future. Me, bankruptcy judge, I'm going to mandate that you, Hertz, can only buy electric vehicles. Well, obviously, most of us will look at that and say, what does a bankruptcy judge have to do with any of this? And that's kind of been the problem with the conservatorship of Fannie and Freddie. It's so drifted beyond what its statutes intended to be. And I think because of that, there's a real desire to try to bring it to an end. Of course, we've got this greater effort with Elon and Vic on Doge, where there's a real pressure to privatize government resources. I certainly should note that as a legal matter, Fannie and Freddie have remained private companies within conservatorship, just as
Right.
Hertz never stopped being private when it entered bankruptcy. And so I give it about 70% chance by, say, 2027 that you can have the policy levers in place and financial health improvement that Fannie and Freddie could be ready to exit conservatorship if all else goes well. And of course, like we were ready to go in 2020, and then this kind of pandemic thing happened. So
Yeah.
there are always external kind of surprises, but I think there's a real inclination, the incoming administration, to try to get these things out of government control in that direction and get them to be essentially regulated like any other large financial company. So, you may appreciate, Richard, that when I was director at FHFA, I would often say to the staff that my objective for Fannie Mae was to have Fannie Mae only be as highly leveraged, mismanaged, and poorly regulated as Citibank. That's all I was trying to achieve. Because again, even banks are federally, government federally chartered,
Sure.
instrumentalities,
Yeah.
government under law. And what Congress was trying to do with the statute, and what I was trying to do as regulator, you know, I wasn't trying, I can't fix everything, but how do I get them to operate on par with other large financial institutions, which also enjoy, some amount of implied guarantee too big to fail?
Right. So, like zooming out a little bit and looking at sort of the whole portfolio of the federal government's sort of housing programs, which there are quite a few, been around for a long time. I was thinking, I was looking at it, there was a recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about sort of federal housing policy in general and what it has or has not accomplished, in the past several decades. So that author says, look, since the late 1960s, homeownership rates have not gone up at all. They're exactly the same. We've spent, taxpayers have spent lots of money on, HUD budgets and other for decades. And uh, the argument is that we haven't really moved the needle. We're sort of expensively managed the housing market we have without actually making any like big improvements. Should the federal government be doing all of this stuff at all? Right. If and so do you think of the case that like all of this money and effort and time and hard work by people such as yourselves who have come in and out of management of these agencies has that all been worth it? And whether yes or no, what's the reasonable way to look at the past since 1967, say, all of that time and effort spent? What would it have to accomplish in order for us to say, yeah, no, that was time and money well spent?
So, well, it's always hard to do counterfactuals. I'm going to start with my conclusion of, had we not created HUD, would housing in this country be less affordable and less readily available? My short answer is no. I mean, I think in the grand scheme of the overall housing market, that had we not created HUD, you probably would have not really noticed. And you might have noticed, and if you had noticed, you might have noticed in a good way that, we didn't have. So HUD has thrown a lot of demand subsidies at the housing market, and of course, supply constraints are the primary problem now. So in some ways, HUD has certainly made it worse by driving up prices. It's also important to keep in mind that the vast majority of what HUD does is grants to local and state governments. So one question would be, and some of it's not just housing, some of it's just infrastructure and other things that local governments do anyhow. So I think we can assume that even if HUD did not provide grants that could be used for sewers, that cities would probably have still built sewers.
Probably.
And again, we also have to remember, in Washington, there's this sometimes pretense that the federal government has a tax base that the rest of the country does not have. We're still
Right.
taxing all the same people.
Mm.
So my point being here is most of the services that HUD has provided grants to local government are services that those local governments would have likely had taxed and provided on their own, and probably
Mm.
done it more efficiently because, as we know, when you're spending your own money, you tend to be more efficient about it than when you're spending money from Washington. So I
Right.
think much of that impact would have happened otherwise. And I think a lot of local governments, I mean, interestingly, New York City, I think, is the one location in America where they spend more of their own money on housing than they get from HUD, even though they get more money from HUD than anybody else. But in fairness, they do spend some of their own state tax dollars. I wouldn't, if as a New Yorker, want that. You should acknowledge that they're not just writing what the federal government does; they tax themselves very heavily as well.
Mhm.
And so, to me, I think if you could devolve most of this back to the states and localities and have them take over those responsibilities and make them take ownership for their own housing markets. Part of the problem with HUD is it allows local jurisdictions that have made it very difficult to build housing to try to just point fingers at the federal government. Well, housing's a federal. Why can't HUD fix this? And you can put the focus back on who's actually the decision makers that made the problem difficult in the first place, which of course are often local state officials who have created these bizarre zoning and entitlement processes. So to me, I think we should ultimately look at downsizing HUD. I think that should be high on any list. Oddly enough, it was actually debated during the Clinton years, whether we should actually downsize HUD. And I think we missed a real opportunity there. Now, should home ownership be the metric? I mean, sometimes that's a helpful measure, but it's often so driven by income and demographics that you've got a lot of other factors going there. If you wanted to be if you wanted to be generous to the pro HUD spending arguments, there's certainly evidence to suggest that a lot of the HUD subsidies, while they haven't added additional units, they've increased the quality of existing units
Hmm.
in privately subsidized housing. Now, of course, it's almost as if we've forgotten a lot of the lessons of the past. And while things like rent control have come back into vogue, unfortunately, so have conversations about public housing. Now, I had felt that we had gotten to a point, at least by the mid 1990s, where we all kind of recognized those, giant Robert Taylor Holmes, Cabrini Green type structures that were built in the 50s and 60s were just not only inefficient, but just inhumane. Just
Right. For in the 90s, that was sort of like the shorthand for a nightmare place to live.
exactly. And what we were doing to people and families by warehousing that kind of poverty. And so I do worry that there's so much conversation, most recently in the conversations around New Green Deal and such, that people have really kind of forgotten how bad public housing really was. And this pretense of somehow, well, we're going to do it right this time. And I worry that we've shifted back. So obviously, I think it's fair to say that on net, all of those things were mistakes. And even, the Clinton administration, which paid to tear down a lot of those structures, admitted those were mistakes. So again, if we had never built all that large scale public housing, I think we would have been far better off. And of course, it's also worth remembering, that large scale public housing was not only used to concentrate and segregate poverty, but also race. It
Mhm.
was a very explicit, many of these programs came out of that very explicit 1930s New Deal aspect where racial segregation was an intent. And I do think we are continuing to struggle with that aftermath of where, again, the New Deal intentionally set up these racial boundaries. So, yeah, I would have been better off if we'd never done any of that. One way of asking it is, would we have better off had Roosevelt not come up with redlining? Yes, absolutely. We would have been better off had not been done. And so, how do we? I think the tough question is, how do you transition it out? How do you try to, get this done in a way where you are minimizing disruptions to the system, but that you are, having an end game, that you are seeing a way to get these responsibilities back to the local level? How do we devolve some of these situations where we can encourage liberalization at the local level and we can encourage greater housing affordability?
Well, yeah, and definitely affordability is a big issue here. During the last election, there's a lot of talk about inflation and affordability of all sorts of things, basic household expenses, groceries, gas, everyone wants to know what the price of eggs was. Um, and plenty of concern obviously about how housing and homeownership at the same time. And so people talking about is it possible for young adults to be able to buy a house the way it was for their parents or grandparents? And this is kind of a policy question, a politics question, but also kind of a social question, sociology kind of question. So, a lot of everyday Americans, I think, have strong feelings about this, like the mortgage and housing market, in ways that they don't when it comes to other macroeconomic statistics, right? Most people don't care quite as much about the balance of payments in global trade or global exchange rates or industrial production capacity, but they care about the housing and mortgage market because almost everyone either pays rent or has a mortgage payment every month. So how does that change like policy, the way politicians talk about this, um, in that it's not a kind of abstract economic issue, it's something virtually every American family has a direct connection to.
I mean, we all, almost all of us pay rent or pay a mortgage, unless, of course, someone else is paying a rent or mortgage on our behalf. And of course, I do think that one of the distinctly important aspects of America itself is private property ownership. And owning a home, while one can rightly debate whether it's a great financial investment, and I think sometimes that has been exaggerated, there is something about having that control over your built environment, a man's castle or a woman's castle.
Mhm.
And so I do think there's something that we all relate to, and certainly part of almost the view of growing up and becoming an adult and becoming is buying a home. And I think a lot of people do aspire to that. Of course, I don't want to imply that if you're a lifelong renter that you've not grown up. That's certainly not the case. And there's plenty of opportunities, and you have to decide where you are in your life cycle. But I do think that there is something beyond simply just the financials to it, or beyond the cold hard public policy of it, because a lot of people really do look at buying a home, raising a family. That is, it sounds hokey, but it truly is part of what we think about as the American dream.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely.
certainly it's been sold that way as a public policy perspective. Now, part of the problem, for instance, most of the way we have historically subsidized this is not really subsidizing home ownership. We've subsidized home debt, which
Hmm.
I think
Right.
to some degree is kind of the opposite of home ownership, if you will. In fact, interesting statistic, before 1960, the overwhelming majority of homes in this country were owned free and clear. Just
Mm-hmm.
imagine that. The majority of American homes where you own the property, it was your house. You didn't owe the bank. You didn't owe anybody. Obviously, there's going to be property taxes and other things, and maybe the government comes and takes your house and puts a highway through it. But more or less, you basically own that home, and it truly was equity that you could either pass down to a generation or you didn't worry about a mortgage. And so, one of the fascinating things about the earlier point about home ownership rates topping out is this really was before the era of massive debt. So, we've seen this massive expansion at the federal level through Fannie, Freddie, FHA, and other sources where we've just thrown a tremendous amount of debt at homeowners. And it's not increased home ownership, but it's increased home indebtedness. And I do
Mhm.
worry about what have we really bought with that. And of course, that home indebtedness have allowed borrowers to compete even more with each other. So it certainly increased housing prices, increased, and ironically enough, in a sense, it's increased unaffordability. I kind of think about it as you may recall, Richard, this is sort of a concept from economics called the winner's curse.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, we've created kind of a winner's curse in housing because let's say you and I are competing over a single property. The more that somebody is willing to lend to both you and I, the more we can bid for that property. And at the end of the day, only one of us are going to get it.
Right.
And we'd be better off if we didn't have this ability to borrow and leverage because the one of us that got it would get it a lot cheaper.
It's time for some game theory here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, when it comes to economic policy, I feel like there's a lot of kind of implicit assumptions here where whether it's the, minimum wage or it's the mortgage interest deduction or all these things where we want to maximize some outcome. Um, but that's not really explicit, and we're not having to debate about who we're favoring here or what outcome we're trying to be maximizing. And all of these exchanges in a market economy have two sides. And I feel like a lot of times we're sort of like, without explicitly declaring it, we're kind of putting our thumb on one side of the scale rather than the other. And sometimes it flip-flops back and forth in a way that like isn't clearly explained. So like in this case, there's kind of a classic conundrum in finance regulation, who benefits, where on the one hand, you could say, well, some people want to support higher housing prices because that
Sure.
means then you're building more equity. Your wealth is increasing, right? And we know there's what economists call the wealth effect. If you feel wealthier, you're more likely to spend, and it creates this multiplier effect and all that sort of stuff. However, obviously, if you're looking to buy a home, especially if you're a first-time home buyer, you want prices to be as low as possible, right? And so do we, when it comes to these policies, are they, is there neutrality or is there even a pretense of neutrality, or are we just kind of flip-flop between favoring one side than the other whenever it kind of seems politically convenient?
I mean, it's a lot of flip-flopping, and there's also a lot of things that are somewhat unintentional. So maybe the best example of this is, the mortgage interest deduction is often kind of presented as a tax benefit for housing. But the reality is that when the tax code was originally created, all interest was deductible. Even like your credit card interest was deductible up until 1986. Obviously, in the early 80s, credit cards were still a little more of a novelty.
Right.
And so it wasn't until tax reform that 1986 that mortgage interest became something separate and different from overall interest deductibility.
Right.
So this wasn't planned. It was really just what came out of a negotiation in what could be politically feasible in tax reform. And obviously in 2017, we went back and pulled back some of that mortgage interest deduction. Now, it's an interesting question about, you know, you may prefer policies that run up prices, but eventually when you sell your house, you still need somewhere to live, and where you're going to move to is going to
Right.
be more expensive too. And I also think even though you may get a wealth effect, which I do believe there's evidence for in terms of, people do feel wealthier and spend more when their housing prices go up, but it attracts mortgage capital. And at the end of the day, one of the probably, if not the single most important concept for economic growth is productivity.
Hmm.
And you and I spending a lot of money bidding against each other to run up housing prices does not increase the productivity of the economy.
Right.
We would have been better if you and I had spent that money building plants. I mean, and I don't mean plants as in, you know, flowers. I mean, manufacturing. I mean investment capital. So even though housing is sometimes thought about as capital, it's really not in the same way. And ultimately, what grows an economy is increasing your capital relative to your labor. And I do think actually all of these housing subsidies have not only made it housing more expensive, I believe they've made our economy less productive because rather than investing in capital, we've invested in running up housing prices, which makes your income lower than it would be otherwise. So you may be a wealthier here from a wealth effect, but you're poorer from a lower wage effect. Now, of course, like that which is unseen. You don't necessarily see that you would be making higher today if we had invested more in capital rather than housing because you don't notice that your wage increases that never happened.
Right.
But as a counterfactual, again, I think we've made our economy poorer with our housing subsidies.
Well, that's a good opportunity to say, or for me to ask you, what do you think is the like best advice that you could give the next, FHFA director, the people that are working at HUD? Um, what's the thing that you're worried they're going to drop the ball on or forget to do? That can, knowing that there's constraints here, right? Federal versus state and local and all that kind of stuff. What would you really like want them to remember?
I think you first remember like do no harm. Like it's a supply constrained environment. Don't add fire to the fuel by increasing demand subsidies. And if you could really internalize that, and you that a lot else flows from that. The other thing I probably would also, I know you asked for one, but man, a second. I really found somewhat to my pleasant surprise as running FHFA, it's not as hard to take on the special interest as you think it is if you're willing to do it. I mean, yes, 90% of what you hear will be people who have a financial interest. But at the end of the day, if you can articulate that here's my job, here's the law, and you stick to it and you're willing to be polite about it and friendly about it, you don't need to be nasty about it. Of course, I think it's always best to be gracious in winning when you do win. And so I really would recommend you have more political maneuverability to kind of take on the swamp if you want than you think you do.
Right.
And you should leverage that and you really should push it to the maximum.
All right. Excellent. I like that suggestion. So, Mark, thank you so much. This has been an excellent conversation. Before we go, where should people seek out your extensive knowledge and commentary these days?
Oh, well, thank you. My stuff is still on the Cato website. A lot of papers and of course my most recent book you can get a link to, which I read about my experiences running a federal agency. And part of the reason to write the book is I did want to encourage, libertarians and others to get in government. Someone else is going to be in that seat. I prefer it be us. And I think that you can make a really big difference in the room. And I think it's important to be able to bring a skepticism of government to government. So again, at the Cato website, I'm listed under the scholars there. All of my work is there, so it's very easy to find.
Yeah, and everyone, the next time CNBC does a segment on housing. You may just see Mark on that screen. All right. Thanks again, Mark, for being with us.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Richard. Be well.